Where do we begin? I will say I really ought to have just preached something fun. And maybe we'll enjoy this too, but it was a stretch for me because I typically like things I can wrap up. I want to tie it up, send you on your way with good cheer, like enjoy yourself. But when Audrey, as we looked for musicians, let's just keep Chuck and Bonnie in prayer as they work through COVID as it makes its rounds yet again. Um, I, oh, good. Kristen says they're doing really well. And reading just the messages and the space people were in. I would like to say I set a record by saying what I would preach this week. It was not on Friday. It was at least Tuesday I knew that I would preach Song of the Vineyard. As I think about the last, I don't know, I wish I would only say a few weeks, but I can probably say the last eternity, there have been a lot of drops into this bucket of unprecedented times that we live in, so much so that I don't even know if I can say they're unprecedented anymore. I don't remember what a precedented time was. All of my times are unprecedented. All of my bingo cards are full and they're all shocking. But in the last month or so, I have been lamenting. I have been in mourning. I mourn the state-sanctioned execution of Marcellus Williams by the state of Missouri, executed for a crime he did not commit. I mourn and my heart breaks for the children, parents, teachers, and community members yet again reeling from another school shooting, this one in Appalachia High School in Georgia, that took the lives of Richard and Christina, teachers, and students Mason and Christian. We turn on the news and we see a divided nation. We are bombarded with racist and misogynistic rhetoric. We watch as immigrants are accused of vile and untrue behavior towards domestic pets and animals, setting that Haitian community in Ohio reeling to defend themselves. There's war abroad and there's war at home, whether it's nations or people who should call one another neighbors. Everywhere we turn, we see violence, we see brokenness, and we see systems designed to crush those who are already oppressed. For me, it is overwhelming. I am left asking, where is justice? Where is the righteousness that we so desperately need? And yet, this week, I realized it's still not new. Isaiah, while speaking to the people of his time, who in earlier chapters were accused and called to the carpet for not taking care of widows and orphans, for oppressing the impoverished and poor more so than what they were already oppressed, he asked them similar questions. The song that is being sung is a song of heartbreak, about a vineyard planted with love and care, yet yielding nothing but wild, bitter grapes. It was supposed to yield justice, but it did not. It was supposed to produce righteousness, but it did not. This is almost an early prequel to the parables that we see in the New Testament. It's a mirror for us too. It challenges us to examine our own vineyards. The same brokenness that plagued Isaiah and that world plagues our own. We see it in the names that I've read, in the faces and hearts of those we lost, in the divisions that tear us apart, in systems that uphold inequity. Now, I like to name the complicated bits first. Like, I'm good for a really good trigger warning. Like, I want you to make the choice to whether now you go get in your car or do you wait me out. So let's do that. Let's just get to the things. I even wore my hard worker shirt because I just wanted you all to know not only how hard I worked, but that sometimes it takes hard work to do hard things. This text is tough. The Old Testament can be tough for a lot of us. It confronts us with these images of God that are unsettling, sometimes uncomfortable. We get God's anger, judgment, and sometimes vengeance. And those aren't always easy to sit with, especially for us Anabaptists. We lean heavily into the image of Jesus and his nonviolent and peace-loving redemption, which is still true. But what do we do when we're faced with a text like this? What do we do when God looks at something that has failed to produce and destroys it? There's tension there. I feel it in my body right now. I feel like I can't catch my breath. I'm like, oh, Jesus. There's discomfort. We don't like to think of God laying waste to our vineyard or to us. It's fearful. It's sad. Maybe even it's an injustice in and of itself. While reading, even I had to ask myself, how do I reconcile this loving God with a God that responds this way? How do I make sense of this God with the other images of grace and mercy and second chances that we know God for? But then I had to check myself. And because I love you, I'll just check you too. I had to check myself on how we want to rush to the reconciliation. We want to skip past the sadness, the grief, the brokenness, the destruction. And we just kind of want to get to the good part, so they say. In a 2-hour movie, you want to just fast forward through the plot points when it gets bad and it's tense and you don't know who the villain is and you got to make it through the origin story and you just want to get to where everything is buttoned up. But we can't do that. We can't skip the messy parts of repair. Now, I have learned more in my last year here about agriculture, farming, pets, and all sorts of things. I don't typically use it as a metaphor because I really still don't know. I've also learned a lot about cabinet making and construction and all of the ways of the DIY life that we have known. And when I say we, I don't mean me because I do nothing myself. I'm not good that way. But I would like to think, in the shows my wife watches, TLC or Home, there's this guy named Pepe somewhere in England that's building a chateau. I don't know. But sometimes, she even follows on Patreon. I'm like, we giving him $10 a month to lay concrete? This is interesting. But I mean, whatever. But sometimes he'll lay the concrete and then he takes the little concrete scraper tool. Yell at me later for not knowing what that is. And it's a mess and he has to break it all up and he has to start again. We see this pattern of destruction or or tearing down happen through our lives. But when it comes to certain things, it's harder to sit in. We can't bypass those hard parts, not even when it comes to God and our relationship. We can't skip over that God also feels betrayal. We can't skip that we are a people called to cultivate justice and righteousness, and once injustice begins to grow unchecked, we can't skip that there might be some organic and natural response to that. God is not indifferent to our suffering. God is not indifferent to the sour grapes. There's a deep sadness in this passage that starts with, I started a vineyard for my beloved, and ends with distress, exclamation point. I think we need to sit in those complicated feelings and not rush past them because this text invites us to grapple with the reality of what happens when we don't act. This is what happens when we don't take things as serious as it may seem. This text asks us to reckon with a God who's not indifferent to the cries of the oppressed, a God who expected something and when it didn't come, responded in a way that even though we may do it, we may not agree with it when we see it. What does it mean for us to tend our vineyards well? What does it mean to respond appropriately when all of that wellness and all that you've done still yields wild grapes? Do we let it grow or do we confront it even when it's uncomfortable? Some of us are not well practiced in that area. We were taught that you cannot question God or even ask God questions. So when the tough things happen, you're kind of just left waiting, hoping that something comes in and rescues. Maybe up until now, you've seen this text and said, this is not a song I care to listen to. This song of the Vineyard can stay here. I'm moving on to better scriptures. But this time, let's grapple with it. There's something sacred when you grapple with God. We see this in Jacob, who wrestled with the angel all night long in Genesis, refusing to let go until they received something, a blessing. That struggle, though he got the blessing, also left him with a limp. A reminder that encountering God in these difficult places changes you. It marks you. It makes you different. The struggle is where that transformation happened. We also see it with Moses when he encounters God in the burning bush. He wasn't running to say yes to God. He wrestled with his doubts, his insecurities, his impediments. Who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the Israelites out of Egypt? But he didn't break away. He engaged with it fully, pushing back on what he thought was impossible. Yet in that wrestling, God provided him strength and the words to carry out this daunting task. Both Jacob and Moses shows that when we grapple with the hard, complicated truth and the uncomfortable realities, we enter into what's holy. We are changed, equipped, and called to step into the work that lies ahead. I know this text is an emotional roller coaster, and I think Audrey, knowingly or unknowingly, made it even more tense as we read it aloud. Me and Kristen was like, oh, we're going to do the slanted parts now. And I knew the scripture, but I didn't know when she was going to do the slant. I was like, man, we got the distraction. We should have went with the other part. It began so sweet in this emotional roller coaster. It was very Song of Solomon-esque, bride to bride or bride to bridegroom, depending on your gender choices and who you love. It hooked me with the prose. I was like, okay, this sounds great. There's care. There's God as the overseer, but then God again as the watcher, the nurturer of this vineyard, God with all of this expectation. Ooh, we about to get good wine, great fruit. The party's going to be lit. And then it changes. And you don't really even get a lot. It's like by verse 4, you're like, uh-oh, I see where this is going. From this poetic vineyard, we move to something else. We hope that through time and patience and care that something will come out that's beautiful and nourishing. But all of that turns bitter as the vineyard, despite all of that care, produces wild sour grapes. In my mind, I'm like, ooh, that heartbreak is real. Like, what a bad day. But it is such a good metaphor for the care of creation. In the face of the shift, my mind was like, oh, poor Judah, they're getting in trouble. Let me move on. Let's see what's happening over in Luke. Let's hit this New Testament real quick. Let me find something different to preach. It's not too late. They're used to me. This is what we do. I'm sure I have a good faith prayer building in my belly, something on prosperity. We could do something that'll leave them feeling a little bit better. But then I read it again and again and again, and started to ask myself, where do we, new creation, find ourselves in this? And even deeper, where do we as individuals find ourselves in this text? It's easy to read about the vineyard and think of it as some distant metaphor. It was them. It was Judah. It was those people. But now we get to reflect and see, what about us? Do we see ourselves as the ones tending the vineyard? The ones who've been entrusted with the care of justice and righteousness, but perhaps allowed wild grapes to grow, whether it was through negligence, whether it was through inaction, whether it was just through fear and not knowing what to do next? Or are we the ones who were crushed by the injustice, the one whose cries for righteousness have gone unheard? In the first group, it's an opportunity to investigate our privilege, to examine whether we've been cultivating justice or if we have been culpable and letting oppression take root. For those who find themselves on the other side, who have been oppressed, persecuted, it's an opportunity to find a promise that God sees you, that God cares, and that God will respond in a divine way, that the foot of oppression that rests on your neck must be broken and lifted. A reassurance that when systems fail to produce justice, when the fruit of our labor is sour, God is still at work and this creation still evolves. Even when we see brokenness, God is always cultivating something new, shaping and reshaping and destroying and replanting this vineyard to reflect the justice and righteousness that we are called as Christians to pursue. In verse 7, it said, God expected justice, but there was bloodshed. Righteousness, but there was a cry of distress. God is grieved by those wild grapes, but also committed to bringing transformation. And I believe that we are too, even if that means starting over, even if that means being honest about where we fall short and where we step up. Even if that means admitting to the messiness, whether it's of church life, whether it's of democracy, whether it is of the neighbor down the street who you see that doesn't have food. What is our commitment to the replanting of the vineyard? When I was a kid, my granddad and Mama June had a grapevine in the backyard. And no one would eat the grapes but me. I don't know what was wrong with them, but whatever. But in thinking about that, just this morning as I was sitting out, I had to write it in. The grapes were bitter. They were like those wild, tart grapes, and I loved them. They were my favorite thing. And nobody else ate them, so it felt like something that I got just for myself, because those other kids were terrible. And so I was grateful to have it. And today, as I was sitting there thinking about it and reading through this sermon, that I was like, oh my God, they're going to be sick of this. I thought about it. Were those grapes really good? Or had I experienced so much trauma even up to that point that I was satisfied by whatever the vine produced and not willing to do something different? No one else would eat them, so I was good. I had my own. They were tart and they were bitter. Was it just a resonance with those parts of me that had grown tart and grown bitter so that I couldn't even recognize that I deserved a better fruit? I know it now, and I know that we do too. Growing up, I heard preachers say that the Old Testament is the New Testament concealed, and that the New Testament is the Old Testament revealed. I thought it was clever and it rhymed, so I was in. Give me a good little rap or a little hippity-dippity, and I got it, I'm with it. But as I was thinking of this, it finally unlocked, like, oh, I see it. I think about Jesus young and in synagogue hearing Isaiah. Was he like, oh man, that guy, he knew what he was talking about? Or was he like, man, Isaiah again? Because it became a very formational part as we get to the New Testament. There are a lot of pieces of Isaiah that get unlocked and cross as we move from the Old Testament into the New. Isaiah's imagery of the vineyard and God's response to its wild grapes finds its parallel in Matthew chapter 21. Jesus tells the parable of another vineyard. Like Isaiah's story, this vineyard was planted and entrusted, but instead of tending it with care, privilege was abused. In Matthew 21, verses 33 through 46, they mistreated the servants sent to collect the fruit, and ultimately they killed the landowner's son. In this story, Jesus is speaking directly to the religious leaders of the time, but we can't miss the connection to Isaiah's prophecy. Both texts reveal a God who cares about what happens, a God that cares about how justice is carried out and how righteousness is cultivated. Both warn us that when we fail to produce good fruit, when injustice takes root, there are consequences. Both point out God's relentless pursuit of transformation and redemption. Even when the vineyard fails, God doesn't give up on it. The story continues. The vineyard is replanted. God remains invested in its flourishing. I probably should have told you in the beginning that I don't wrap this up well. There is no bow. There's just questions. Opportunities for us to, I know sometimes, I'm always telling a random story. So we get these Home Chef boxes for subscription so I can cook dinner. The way my ADHD works, meal planning, you would have peanut butter and jelly every day. I would make the same meal every day as long as the texture worked out. So we get these boxes, and the box comes with everything you need in it. It has the meat, it has the vegetables, beautiful zucchinis, great squash, a little pesto here, a little garlic salt there, whatever. But even with all that preparation, all that planning, and the fact I know in 30 minutes I'll have a nice home-cooked meal, sometimes I just want McDonald's. There's no rhyme or reason. It's gonna make my stomach hurt. So what? I just want a quarter pounder with Big Mac sauce. It just is what it is. I know it may not be the best thing. I know it may not be the best choice. I know that I could have done different, but sometimes I just want something already done. This is not a fast food service. This is an ingredient service. So here's the squash. Here's the garlic pepper. Here's a dash of the good olive oil from the artisan shop down the street. And you get to decide what your vineyard looks like. You get to decide how you tend to it. You get to decide what has taken root. You get to decide, are those grapes bitter and does it need to be destroyed? And then within the love and care of community, you also get to decide how you will cultivate that garden again and again and again, because we're gonna mess it up. Destruction is not the end. And this, if you go home and you want to read more of this chapter, let me just tell you, it does not get better. It is doom. It is gloom for a lot. So read to your own strength and or peril, like whatever you choose to do. I am not giving that homework assignment, but it'll help give you context. But the thing I want to hone in on is that it's not over. Even when the vineyard gets destroyed or torn down, even when it felt like all hope is lost, God is not finished. God is a God of renewal and restoration. Where there is destruction, there's also the possibility of new life, a new creation. Destruction is not the final word. New life, justice, righteousness possible. But are we willing to do the work of tearing down? Are we willing to deconstruct? Are we willing to divest from the norms, from what we have come to expect? God walks with us in that rebuilding, but the vineyard won't flourish if we don't do that work. We have to ask ourselves, where have we allowed the wild grapes of neglect to grow in our community? How can we cultivate righteousness in our daily actions? Part of my job as a pastor is to preach the good news, and there's good news in this too. The Bible does not end at Isaiah. It is not the last story in the 66 books. The broken thread that we end with in Isaiah is carried through to Matthew. And it is that continuation, that promise of a new creation, that brings us to the table of communion. This table is not just about the bread and the wine. This table represents a destruction of something old and the promise of something new. Just as the vineyard needed to be replanted, Christ's body was broken so that a new life and a new way for us could emerge. This meal is an invitation to participate in that renewal. When we take the bread, we remember the body of Christ broken for us. not to leave us in despair, but to bring forth justice and righteousness that we would have access to. When we drink from the cup, and in some faith traditions and some translations, that cup is bitter. It is wild grapes. When we drink from the cup, we're reminded of the bloodshed, but also a covenant of hope and redemption. A message that even when we see wild grapes around us, broken systems, injustice, oppression, we know that that is not how our story ends. Communion is an entry point to renewal. It's like TSA. You bring all your baggage, it gets scanned through, you get out to the other side, no messages, now you can travel. It's a time to exchange what has been broken and to care for and nurture what's good. As the volunteers come up to prepare for communion and get things ready, I invite you all to our open table. A table of grace, renewal, redemption, and restoration. A table that knows what to do with our sour grapes. A table where we don't run from the cup of bitterness just to get to the cup that is blessed, because we know that in both we see who God is. It is our place of exchange. A place where we invite God to destruct and destroy and break down the parts of us that we want to change and we want to grow and move in. I invite you to this table. Come, for all is ready and all are welcome. Come, because even in the song of the Vineyard, the verses continue to write themselves even now. Come and partake, knowing that God is not done with us. God is not finished, and neither are we. I invite you to the open table.